Jane begins chapter 21 by talking about presentiments and talking about dreams and omens and things that seem to tell the future in some sort of way. She talks about how she used to dream as a child and what she thought those dreams meant. And then she says, during the past week, scarcely a night had gone over my couch that had not brought with it a dream of an infant, which I sometimes hushed in my arms, sometimes dandled on my knee, sometimes watched playing with daisies on the lawn, or again, dabbling its hands in running water. It was a wailing child this night, and a laughing one the next. Although you may not know what the child in her dream means, you should pay attention to dreams whenever they happen in books. They are always going to be important in some way, shape, or form. One morning, Jane wakes up and she hears that there's a visitor for her. So she goes to see, and he stands up and says, I dare say you hardly remember me, miss, but my name is Levin. I lived coachman with Mrs. Reed. And Jane says, of course I remember you. You're married to Bessie. Remember, Bessie was one of her only friends at the Reed household. He responds, yes, Bessie, she's doing great. And we've actually got 3 kids, just had our 3rd, so we're doing really well. Jane then says, and are the family well at the house, Robert? And he says, I'm sorry I can't give you better news of them, miss. They are very badly at present, in great trouble. And then Jane says, well, I hope no one's dead. And she sort of seems to be saying it in a jokey way, which is a big mistake because Levin replies, Mr. John died yesterday was a week at his chambers in London. Mr. John being the 22-year-old, the older sibling to Jane when she was a child. He was a bully to her, he was not very nice, and then later he got into some money problems. But we find out that he died last week, and it seems like suicide. He took his own life. So, because of all this and because of all the pain that the Reeds have been going through, Mrs. Reed has gotten increasingly sick. And because of this, she sends Levin to go get Jane Eyre because she has something to talk to her about. Jane says, okay, yeah, well, I didn't like her as a guardian, but I think I owe it to her to at least spend a couple days with her while she's near her life's end. So she talks to Rochester and basically says, I'm going to have to go for a couple weeks. He doesn't really understand it, but he's willing to grant her the leave and says, hurry back. You're not allowed to stay there because I'll miss you a lot. And she's thinking, oh, right, you'll miss me a lot when Blanche is here and you don't even have to look at me anymore. But then Mr. Rochester does a very interesting thing. Remember that her yearly salary is 30 pounds. He says, well, you don't really have any money, do you? You're going to need money on a trip. And she says, yeah, I've only got 5 shillings, which is not very much at all. So he gives her 50 pounds. That's 20 pounds more than she needed the whole year. So Mr. Rochester's intentions are a little bit obscure, a little bit vague. What exactly is he wanting to do? What's he trying to do here? They continue to talk for a little bit, but then she says she has to go. And Mr. Rochester says, and how do people perform that ceremony of parting, Jane? Teach me, I'm not quite up to it. Well, they say farewell, or any other form they prefer. Then say it. Farewell, Mr. Rochester, for the present. What must I say? The same, if you like, sir. Farewell, Miss Eyre, for the present. Is that all? Yes. It's a little bit cringe, but it was probably a lot cuter when you read this in the 1800s. Bronte doesn't spend too much time telling us about the trip back. She's just not worried about it. But when Jane gets back to her old house, she sees everything is pretty much exactly as she left, except for the people. They've changed a lot. She sees all these familiar books along the walls, and she remembers all of the furniture, and that's all exactly the same. It's only the people that have changed. Talking about Mrs. Reed, who is apparently so sick that she can't see Jane right now, Jane says, quote, I had left this woman in bitterness and hate, and I came back to her now with no other emotion than a sort of ruth for her great sufferings, and a strong yearning to forget and forgive all injuries. Eventually, Jane does make it to the room, but it's clear that Mrs. Reed is not in her right mind. She talks about Jane Eyre for a little bit, not realizing that she's talking to Jane about herself. And she says, I wish she had died at Lowood Institution. Clearly, there's something wrong with Mrs. Reed's brain. But then Jane says, that's strange. Why do you wish she had died? Why do you hate her so much? And we find out that Mrs. Reed didn't like Jane because of some really complicated family issues of her own. Apparently, Mrs. Reed and her sister, who was Jane's mom, didn't get along at all. They had a lot of issues, and so that anger trickled down to the niece and made her not like her as much. This chapter's a little bit dry, it's a little bit boring. She goes on a lot of walks with Georgiana and Eliza. She's just hanging out with the family, but she's wondering, why did Mrs. Reed call her here? And then a few days into her stay, she goes into the bedroom, and Mrs. Reed says, well, I must get it over with. Eternity is before me. Mrs. Reed knows she's going to die, so she has something to give to Jane. She says, I'd better tell her. Go to my dressing case, open it, and take out a letter you will see there. This letter is dated from 3 years ago, and it's from somebody named John Eyre. Apparently, he's a long-lost uncle of Jane's, and he wants to see her. He wants to adopt her and take care of her because they're the only family that anybody has. Jane asks Mrs. Reed, why did I never hear of this? And Mrs. Reed says honestly, because I didn't like you. I hated you. I didn't want you to have any good things in life. And so we're realizing, ooh, this is a rough family to grow up in. It's no wonder that John Reed turned out the way he did. It turns out that Mrs. Reed, when she had gotten that original letter, wrote back to John saying that Jane had died of typhus at Lowood, around the same time as Helen Burns had died earlier. And so now Jane has this letter, and Mrs. Reed is saying, I'm going to die soon. I think you should write him and tell him that I lied. I'm sorry about this, but I wanted to try and do my best to make it right before I left. Jane's fairly upset about all of this, but she's still so kind. And she says, Mrs. Reed, all I want to do is be reconciled to you. Please just kiss me on the cheek so I know that we're okay before you pass. And then she leans down, and Mrs. Reed won't go near her. So clearly she still hates Jane, and she still has some problems here. The chapter ends with the death of Mrs. Reed, and none of the three daughters seem to really care that much. It's a sad death, and even though she's got her family there, she dies very alone in the world. Chapter 22 is pretty short, only a few things that I want to point out here. I like this. Georgiana said she dreaded being left alone with Eliza. From her, she got neither sympathy in her dejection, support in her fears, nor aid in her preparations. The sisters are done with this. They just want to get out. Now that their mother's gone, they just don't feel like they should stay here anymore. In fact, Eliza says she's planning on becoming a nun. She says, I shall take up my abode in a religious house near Lisle, a nunnery, you would call it. Jane spends a few days with Georgiana and Eliza, helping them to get everything over with, helping them to get packed and ready for the day. But then eventually she heads back to Thornfield. She walks, she rides a carriage, and eventually she makes it. And she sees Mr. Rochester, and one of his first questions is, what the deuce have you done with yourself this last month? He's missed her a lot, apparently. He thought she'd only be gone for a week, but it was closer to a month. She says, I've been with my aunt, sir, who is dead. And he says, well, very well. As they're walking back to the house, Mr. Rochester says, tell me, is there something that would make me a more handsome man? And Jane says, it would be past the power of magic, sir, which is a good burn. But then she continues to say, a loving eye is all the charm needed. To such, you are handsome enough, or rather your sternness has a power beyond beauty. She's come to realize and sort of say it out loud that she cares about Mr. Rochester, that she thinks he's handsome and that she loves him a lot. Jane says, quote, that evening I shut my eyes resolutely against the future. I stopped my ears against the voice that kept warning me of near separation and coming grief. So she's thinking, yeah, this probably won't end well for us in this relationship, but I'm just going to do my best because that's all I can do. In these days, she ends the chapter by saying, never had he called me more frequently to his presence, never been kinder to me, when there, and alas, never had I loved him so well. So even though he's clearly planning to marry Blanche, and they're actually making a lot of wedding plans about it, and figuring out invitations, decorations, all of that, Jane keeps falling for Mr. Rochester harder and harder. Chapter 23 of Jane Eyre starts with a description of the weather. Skies so pure, sun so radiant, as were then seen in long succession. Weather usually reflects the way that somebody's feeling in the story, so things are okay at the beginning of chapter 23. Things are going pretty well. It says, quote, "On Midsummer Eve, Adele, weary with gathering wild strawberries in Hay Lane half the day, had gone to bed with the sun. I watched her drop asleep, and when I left her, I sought the garden." She's walking through the garden, and she's smelling all the flowers, just going through nature, when she smells something that she recognizes. It's Mr. Rochester's cigar. He smokes occasionally, and she goes, "Oh, I don't want him to see me out here." So she sort of leans back, she gets out of the way a little bit, and she watches him as he comes into this clearing. She's perfectly still. She's thinking, I can just stay quiet, and then he won't notice me. Everything's going to be okay. And then without even looking at her or acknowledging her presence in any way, he says, "Jane, come and look at this fellow." I had made no noise. He had not eyes behind. Could his shadow feel? So Mr. Rochester apparently knew she was here, and he's just being weird about it. They start to talk a little bit about Thornfield, and Rochester's asking Jane what she thinks about it. And he says, "You would be sorry to part with them," them meaning Adele and Thornfield, and she says, "Yes." And then he goes, "No sooner have you got settled in a pleasant resting place than a voice calls out to you to rise and move on, for the hour of repose is expired." And Jane says, "Must I move on, sir? Must I leave Thornfield?" And he replies, "I believe you must, Jane. I am sorry, Janet, but I believe indeed you must." So Rochester's saying that he's going to kick her out if she doesn't leave of her own accord. But he says, "No need to worry. I've talked to some people in Ireland. I've got you a new place to work at so that when I'm married to Blanche, you can have your own job and everything's going to be okay." But she says, "It's a long way off." And he says, "It's not that big of a deal." And she goes, No. It's a long way off from you." So she's making her feelings and her intentions known to him in this chapter. She says, "I grieve to leave Thornfield. I love Thornfield. I love it because I have lived in it a full and delightful life." Momentarily, at least. They continue to argue, to fight about this, but then Rochester says, "Jane, come to my side, and let us explain and understand one another." "I will never again come to your side," she replies. "I am torn away now and cannot return." And Rochester says, "But Jane, I summon you as my wife. My wife! It is you only I intend to marry." I was silent. I thought he mocked me. It's a weird proposal. It's not typically how things are done at a nice 5-star restaurant on one knee, but Rochester asks Jane to marry him, and she's blown away. She doesn't understand what to do here. But then he goes on to explain himself. "What love have I for Miss Ingram, Blanche? None, and that you know. What love has she for me? None, as I have taken pains to prove. I caused a rumor to reach her that my fortune was not a third of what was supposed, and after that I presented myself to see the result. It was coldness, both from her and her mother. I could not marry Miss Ingram." So in order to test if Blanche actually liked him, he let a rumor slip, not a true rumor, that he only had a third of the money he had, and she stopped liking him after that. So he realizes how shallow of a person he is and knows that Jane would never act like that. Here's a picture of them. Do you want to see it? While the weather was really good at the beginning of this chapter, as we get towards the end, it says, quote, "Joy soon effaced every other feeling, and loud as the wind blew, near and deep as the thunder crashed, fierce and frequent as the lightning gleamed, cataract-like as the rain fell during a storm of 2 hours' duration, I experienced no fear and little awe." So it's a storm happening around here. It's a violent, chaotic storm, but she feels fine. She's just happy that Rochester seems to actually like her, to actually care about her. "Before I left my bed in the morning, little Adele came running in to tell me that the great horse chestnut at the bottom of the orchard had been struck by lightning in the night, and half of it split away." So we've got this image of a tree, and it's a tree that's split in half. I think this tree is representative of something, but there's a couple different possibilities. It could be the union between Blanche and Mr. Rochester and how that's broken away,
or how Jane's life has changed and split in a way that she never would have expected. 24 begins with Jane thinking about herself and thinking, I'm actually not that ugly. She says, I looked at my face in the glass, that is the mirror, and felt it was no longer plain. There was hope in its aspect and life in its color. So again, a very strong parallel to Rebecca, where after the narrator finds out everything that Max de Winter did, she actually starts to like him, to grow closer to him. Rochester starts to talk more kindly about Jane to her and to other people. He says, quote, I will make the world acknowledge you a beauty too. He went on, while I really became uneasy at the strain he had adopted, because I felt he was either deluding himself or trying to delude me. So even though Jane has only received good news, she's only had positive interactions, now she's suddenly thinking, does he mean it? Is this real? She's starting to doubt herself again, to snowball, to be anxious. While they're talking in this chapter, Mr. Rochester promises Jane anything she wants in the world. And she's thinking, anything? She has something very specific in mind, but she's sort of toying with him a little bit, trying to think, does he really love me enough to give me anything? He says, I'll give you half of my estate. I'll pretty much do anything. And she has just one question. Why did you take such pains to make me believe you wish to marry Miss Ingram? And he has a simple response. I knew jealousy would be the best ally I could call in for the furtherance of that end. So Rochester's plan this whole time was to marry Jane, but the only way he thought that he could get it to work was if he made her jealous. That's a red flag in a relationship. Jane seems more concerned about Blanche's feelings than Rochester does. She asks, did you think nothing of Miss Ingram's feelings, sir? And he replies, her feelings are concentrated in one, pride, and that needs humbling. So Rochester is taking it upon himself to not only get Jane to fall in love with him, but teach somebody who's too proud a lesson along the way. Definitely weird. Mrs. Fairfax's reaction to all this news is a bit odd. Seeing me, it says, she roused herself. She made a sort of effort to smile and framed a few words of congratulations. But the smile expired and the sentence was abandoned unfinished. She put up her spectacles, shut the Bible, and pushed her chair back from the table. So Mrs. Fairfax has some odd feelings about this. Perhaps this is because she knows something that we as the reader don't know. She says to Jane, remember, all is not gold that glitters, which is a quote from a Shakespeare play. Basically, if something looks really good, it might be, but it also might not be at all. So you should be very careful when you're going into this. Jane takes offense to this and says, is it impossible that Mr. Rochester should have a sincere affection for me? And Mrs. Fairfax says, no, you are very well and much improved of late, and Mr. Rochester, I dare say, is fond of you. Then she says, I have always noticed that you were a sort of pet of his. So Mrs. Fairfax sees Jane not as an equal, but as somebody who's underneath Rochester, who serves him. The conversation ends with Mrs. Fairfax saying, whatever, you do what you want, all I ask is that you be as careful as possible. A little later in the chapter, Mr. Rochester is going to sing a song, and I note that Jane sits at the windowsill, just like in the very first section of the book when she's a little girl trying to hide from John. She sits in this windowsill and just listens to her fiancé start to play and sing this song. Jane spends the rest of the chapter trying to figure out how to be the best fiancé, how she's going to be a good wife and a good mistress of Thornfield, and how she's going to run everything. And the last paragraph is especially important. Yet after all, my task was not an easy one. Often I would rather have pleased than teased him. My future husband was becoming to me my whole world, and more than the world, almost my hope of heaven. He stood between me and every thought of religion, as an eclipse intervenes between man and the broad sun. I could not, in those days, see God for his creature, of whom I had made an idol. So Jane's writing this first-person narrative, but she's clearly writing it from a spot in the future, so she can sort of think back as to how she was feeling when all of this was going on. And she realizes, I liked him too much. I had made an idol of him. I was worshiping him and not God as I should be. Chapter 25 begins with Jane wanting to talk to Mr. Rochester. He's been out of the house all day, and she doesn't feel like she can wait for him to come home that night. So she decides to go outside and start walking down the road, hoping to run into him. At the beginning of the third paragraph of this chapter, she says, "I had at heart a strange and anxious thought. Something had happened which I could not comprehend. No one knew of or had seen the event but myself. It had taken place the preceding night." And she says at the bottom of this, "Stay till he comes, reader, and when I disclose my secret to him, you shall share the confidence." So Jane, the narrator, saw something or experienced something previously, but she didn't tell us about it yet because she wants us to find out about it at the same time as Rochester does. She continues to walk down the road, and in an episode eerily similar to when she first met Mr. Rochester, she hears the horse hooves, then sees the dog, then sees the horse, and then she's reunited with her fiancé. When she sees him, she says, "Everything in life seems unreal. It's all like a dream." And he says, "Except me. I am substantial enough. Touch me." She says, "You, sir, are the most phantom-like of all. You are a mere dream." As they're riding back, she begins to tell him this story of something that she saw the night before. She says, "During all my first sleep, I was following the windings of an unknown road. Total obscurity environed me. Rain pelted me. I was burdened with the charge of a little child, a very small creature, too young and feeble to walk, and which shivered in my cold arms and wailed piteously in my ear." Remember, dreams are important. Not only is this one showing that Jane is a caring person, but it also seems to be a callback to when she used to have a doll in her bed every night to take care of. In the middle of the story, Rochester stops her and asks, "Do you love me, Jane? Repeat it," almost as a command. She does it, and then she continues on in the story. She says, "I dreamt another dream, sir. That Thornfield Hall was a dreary ruin, the retreat of bats and owls." This reminds me of the first line of Rebecca, "Last night I dreamt of Manderley again," and how the narrator describes this house, this magnificent mansion that's fallen apart. It seems that Daphne du Maurier, who wrote Rebecca, took a lot of inspiration from this part especially. She keeps on talking about the dreams, and Rochester's saying, "Okay, get on with it. Why are you telling me all these dreams?" And she says, "Oh, no. The dreams aren't even the important part. I'm just leading up to the really important part." She says that when she wakes up, she sees a candle in her room, which scares her because she didn't leave any burning, so she thinks somebody must have brought it in. But then she says, "There was a light on the dressing table, and the door of the closet, where before going to bed I had hung my wedding dress and veil, stood open. I heard a rustling there." She thinks it's Sophie, but it's not. It's not Leah. It's not Mrs. Fairfax. And she says it's not even Grace Poole, because of course she thinks it's Grace. She's been doing all the weird stuff. Rochester says it must have been one of them, and she says, "No, sir, I solemnly assure you to the contrary. The shape standing before me had never crossed my eyes within the precincts of Thornfield Hall before. The height, the contour were new to me." So Jane Eyre wakes up in the middle of the night, and she sees a strange person in her room, a person who's in the closet messing with her things, and she's terrified. She describes the person. She has a fearful, ghastly, discolored face. Jane says it's a savage face. And all this person does is take Jane's veil in her hands and rip it in half before leaving. Rochester says something along the lines of, "Oh, it's just a dream. Don't worry about it. There's nothing going on." And Jane says, "No, this really happened. I'm not dreaming about this." He says, "It's the creature of an overstimulated brain, that is certain. I must be careful of you, my treasure. Nerves like yours were not made for rough handling." So he's just being misogynistic. He's just saying, "Oh, you're so cute, isn't it? How you see things and your brain's so weak." She says, "Sir, depend on it. My nerves were not in fault. The thing was real." Do you want to see the picture? The proof that she has that this whole incident happened is that when she woke up the next morning, she found the veil torn in half. Rochester says, "I'll explain to you all about it. That woman must have been, Grace Poole. You call her a strange being yourself. From all you know, you have reason so to call her. What did she do to me? What to Mason? Jane refuses to believe what Rochester's saying, but she realizes, okay, he's not going to believe this, so I might as well give it up. Chapter 26 is when Jane and Rochester are going to be married. So, Jane wakes up at the beginning, she gets dressed, and everything's about to be ready. This wedding, as we learned in previous chapters, is not going to be a big one. It's not going to be lavish or expensive, anything like that. It's just going to be Rochester, Jane, and the pastor. That's it. That's all they want. When she gets to the church, she describes it a little bit. She walks inside, and she says, quote, "All was still. 2 shadows only moved in a remote corner. My conjecture had been correct. The strangers had slipped in before us, and now they stood by the vault of the Rochesters, their backs towards us, viewing through the rails the old time-stained marble tomb, where a kneeling angel guarded the remains of Damer de Rochester, slain at Marston Moor in the time of the Civil Wars, and of Elizabeth, his wife." So these 2 strangers that she saw, she had seen earlier outside of the church. She assumes that they are vagrants, vagabonds, just people who are looking for something to do. So now they're going to watch them get married. And Jane doesn't really care about it. The service begins. They say all of the normal stuff. And then the pastor says, "If either of you know any impediment, why ye may not lawfully be joined together in matrimony, ye do now confess it." And then he pauses. And it's the longest pause ever. And Jane's holding her breath. And then she lets it out. He keeps going. "Wilt thou have this woman for thy wedded wife?" When a distinct and near voice said, "The marriage cannot go on. I declare the existence of an impediment." Mr. Rochester seems to shake a little bit, almost looking like he's about to fall down, and then he says, "Proceed." The voice says, "The ceremony is quite broken off. I am in a condition to prove my allegation. An insuperable impediment to this marriage exists. It simply consists in the existence of a previous marriage. Mr. Rochester has a wife now living." Rochester's angry now. He walks up to the person and he's wondering, "Who are you? What do you have to do with this? Why are you doing this to me?" The man says, "My name is Briggs, a solicitor of Blank Street, London." And Rochester goes, "And you would thrust on me a wife? You would make up a wife for me to have just so this wedding doesn't happen?" And Briggs says, "I would remind you of your lady's existence, sir, which the law recognizes if you do not." Briggs pulls out a piece of paper and then he reads, "I affirm and can prove that on the 20th of October, A.D. blank, a date of 15 years back, Edward Fairfax Rochester of Thornfield Hall in the county of blank and of Ferndon Manor in Blankshire, England, was married to my sister, Bertha Antoinetta Mason, daughter of Jonas Mason, merchant, and of Antoinetta, his wife. Signed, Richard Mason." Rochester says, "That, if it's a genuine document, may prove I have been married, but it does not prove that the woman mentioned therein as my wife is still living." And Briggs says, "She was living 3 months ago, and I have someone to prove it." Rochester says, "Well then, produce him or go to hell." "I will produce him first," says the lawyer. "He is on the spot. Mr. Mason, have the goodness to step forward." And then we have Mason, the guest from earlier on in the book, the guest who was mysteriously stabbed and bitten and almost died. He walks back into the room. He says, "She is now living at Thornfield Hall. I saw her there last April. I am her brother." Mr. Rochester decides to cancel the wedding. Obviously, it can't happen, and he says, "Bigamy is an ugly word. I meant, however, to be a bigamist." So he admits, "Yeah, I have a wife living. But fate has outmaneuvered me, or Providence has checked me, perhaps the last. I am little better than a devil at this moment. You say you never heard of a Mrs. Rochester at the house up yonder, Wood," and Wood is the clerk who's been here this whole time taking notes. "But I dare say you have many a time inclined your ear to gossip about the mysterious lunatic kept there under watch and ward. Some have whispered to you that she is my bastard half-sister, some my cast-off mistress. I now inform you that she is my wife, whom I married 15 years ago, Bertha Mason by name." But then Rochester goes on to explain himself, quote, "Bertha Mason is mad. She's insane. And she came out of a mad family, idiots and maniacs throughout 3 generations. And then he says, I invite you all to come up to the house and visit Mrs. Grace Poole's patient and my wife. So we learn so much in this brief page and a half. We find out that Rochester has a wife living, that she's been living at the house this whole time, which explains the mysterious laughter, the fire, all of the different sounds. And then we also find out that Grace Poole's real purpose as a servant, the reason that she gets paid 5 times as much as the other servants, is because she takes care of Mrs. Rochester all the time. As Rochester opens up the door in Thornfield, he says, You know this place, Mason. She bit and stabbed you here. They walk up to the attic, and Jane says, I recognized well that purple face, those bloated features. So this is the person who tore Jane's veil. This is the person who set the fire. This is the person who's been laughing, who's been snooping around at night. This is the person who stabbed and almost killed Mason. Rochester tries to explain himself a little bit, saying, Look, I couldn't be married to an insane person my whole life, and I figured this was the best possible life that I could give her, so she's been stuck up here for a while. Briggs, the lawyer, says, You, madam, he's talking to Jane, are cleared from all blame. Your uncle will be glad to hear it, if indeed he should be still living, when Mr. Mason returns to Madeira. And it turns out that Mr. Mason has been working with John Eyre, Jane's uncle, for a while. And so when Jane's uncle heard about all of this, he sent Mason to put a stop to it, to basically keep it all from happening. So it seems that everybody except for Jane Eyre knows everything else. She's always the one who's kept in the dark, who's trying to figure stuff out alongside the reader. Jane is thinking to herself at the beginning of chapter 27, what am I to do? But, quote, the answer my mind gave, leave Thornfield at once, was so prompt, so dread, that I stopped my ears. She goes downstairs and finds Mr. Rochester, and he's upset. He says, quote, So you shun me? You shut yourself up and grieve alone? I would rather you had come and upbraided me with vehemence. I'd rather you yell at me than treat everything like it's perfectly fine and normal. He ends by saying, Will you ever forgive me? And she says, Reader, I forgave him at the moment and on the spot. So she doesn't harbor any bad feelings, even though she knows that he's an awful, terrible person. At the end of the conversation, he goes near her to try and kiss her, and she turns her face away. What? How is this? He exclaimed hastily. Oh, I know. You won't kiss the husband of Bertha Mason? You consider my arms filled and my embraces appropriated? She replies, At any rate, there is neither room nor claim for me, sir. That's her saying, I'm leaving. I don't belong in this house. You've got a wife, and even if you got rid of her in some illegal way, I don't want to be a part of this at all. Rochester's trying to backtrack. He's trying to keep her there. He says, I was wrong ever to bring you to Thornfield Hall, knowing as I did that it was haunted. We can send Adele away. We can make this work. Please just don't leave. He says, concealing the mad woman's neighborhood from you, however, was something like covering a child with a cloak and laying it down near an upas tree. That demon's vicinage is poisoned and always was. He keeps talking about her, saying how bad of a person she was, and Jane interrupts, saying, It is cruel. She cannot help being mad. Jane's showing a lot of empathy for this person who clearly is not in her right state of mind. Rochester then says, I only ask you to endure one more night under this roof, Jane, and then farewell to its miseries and terrors forever. So he seems to understand that this is the end. This is the end of their story. When he says, I only ask you to endure one more night under this roof, you might assume that he's saying you can leave after this. But that's not what he means. He just means we'll pack our bags and we'll leave together. We'll leave my wife here in this house and we can have a great life. He says, you are to share my solitude. Do you understand? She does not want this and continues to walk away. Jane, he says, will you hear reason? He stooped and approached, his lips to my ear. Because if you won't, I'll try violence. A huge red flag here. Jane's just trying to get out of this house, and Rochester's saying, you're not leaving, and if you won't listen to me, then I have other ways of making you stay. He's clearly demonstrated his other ways of making people stay with the insane wife in the attic. As Jane walks away, Rochester's pleading with her, saying, "Do you love me? Did you ever love me?" And she says, "I do love you, more than ever, but I must not show or indulge the feeling, and this is the last time I must express it." Some of his last words he says here are, "Never fear that I wish to lure you into error, to make you my mistress. Why did you shake your head? Jane, you must be reasonable, or in truth I shall again become frantic." He realizes that she's not going to listen to him, so he says, "All right, listen, I'll tell you everything. Here's my backstory. This is why everything's this way. Hopefully you'll understand." And finally, we as the reader start to learn a little bit more about Rochester's past, what happened between him and his father and his brother. He says, "My father had determined that everything was going to go to my older brother, Roland." So Roland is going to get everything in the inheritance. He's going to get all the money. He's going to get the estate, all of that. But in order to help out Edward Rochester, the Mr. Rochester that we've been hearing about this whole time, the Mr. Rochester that's been in this story the whole time, the father Rochester decides to go and find a wife for his son. Rochester says, quote, "When I left college, I was sent out to Jamaica to espouse a bride already courted for me. My father said nothing about her money, but he told me Miss Mason was the boast of Spanish Town for her beauty, and this was no lie. So she comes from a very rich family, but she's also beautiful." Rochester doesn't know that she's rich. This is something that his father is keeping from him for a reason that we'll find out in just a second. He says they married, everything seemed fine for a while, but then listen. "My bride's mother I had never seen. I understood she was dead. The honeymoon over, I learned my mistake. She was only mad and shut up in a lunatic asylum." And he finds out that all members of this family seem to suffer from serious mental disorders. He ends by saying, "My father and my brother Roland knew all this, but they thought only of the 30,000 pounds and joined in the plot against me." This lends some empathy to Mr. Rochester's character. He was screwed over by his father and his brother for money, and then was forced to marry this woman who he did not know was insane and should have been in a psychiatric ward of some sort. He talks about his wife saying, "Her vices sprang up fast and rank. They were so strong only cruelty could check them. And I would not use cruelty. What a pygmy intellect she had, and what giant propensities." Time goes on for a little bit. Remember, he's been married for 15 years, and in that time, his brother and father dies. So, Rochester gets everything anyways. His father and brother didn't succeed in trying to screw him over. But he realizes, I'm going to be stuck with this woman for the rest of my life. He found out that she's older than they told him, and she's probably going to live just as long as he is, so he's never really going to have an escape here. He says, "I have a right to deliver myself from it if I can. The sufferings of the mortal state will leave me with the heavy flesh that now cumbers my soul." He says at one point that he even considered suicide. Quote, "I meant to shoot myself. I only entertained the intention for a minute, for not being insane, the crisis of exquisite and unalloyed despair, which had originated the wish and design of self-destruction, was past in a second." But nonetheless, he's not having a good time. He hears a voice here, and he calls this voice hope. It says, "Go, and live again in Europe. There it is not known what a sullied name you bear, nor what a filthy burden is bound to you. You may take the maniac with you to England, confine her with due attendance and precautions at Thornfield, then travel yourself to what clime you will, and form what new tie you like." So he's thinking, all right, I'll just leave, and then I can leave my wife at home, and I can just have a life where I travel and never really show back up at the house. And that's what he does for a while. He continues talking to Jane, saying, "All I wanted was a mate, a companion." He remembers Celine Varens, the mother of Adele and his ex-lover. He talks about an Italian, Giacinta, and a German, Clara. These are all people that he tried to find some sort of companionship with, but none of them ended working out, and he just felt lonely. He recalls to Jane the time that he first ran into her, and his horse slipped on ice and he sprained his ankle, and said, "In that moment, I knew you were the one. After all these different women, I knew that you were the perfect one." I don't think Jane really believes this, but she continues listening patiently. He ends his monologue saying, "After a youth and manhood, passed half in unutterable misery and half in dreary solitude, I have, for the first time, found what I can truly love. I have found you. You are my sympathy, my better self, my good angel. I am bound to you with a strong attachment. Jane struggles now. She's trying to figure out what to do. She says, quote, "A hand of fiery iron grasped my vitals. Terrible moment, full of struggle, blackness burning. Not a human being that ever lived could wish to be loved better than I was loved. And him who thus loved me I absolutely worshipped. And I must denounce love and idol. One drear word comprised my intolerable duty. Depart." Rochester says, "Jane, you understand what I want of you? Just this promise. I will be yours, Mr. Rochester." Jane says, "Mr. Rochester, I will not be yours." He keeps pleading with her. He refuses to quit. When words won't work, he gets angry, and it says, quote, "He crossed the floor and seized my arm and grasped my waist. He seemed to devour me with his flaming glance. Physically, I felt at the moment powerless as stubble exposed to the draft and glow of a furnace." So she's scared. She's thinking, okay, now he's actually going to hurt me. But then he says, "I could bend her with my finger and thumb, and what good would it do? If I bent, if I uptore, if I crushed her?" So he's talking to himself. He doesn't seem to be all the way in his right mind either, although it's just anger. Eventually, Jane starts to get away. She says, "God bless you, my dear master. God keep you from harm and wrong," etc., etc. And then she says, "Farewell." Despair added, "Farewell forever." That night, she can barely sleep. She's trying to figure out what the heck she's going to do, but she realizes that she needs to leave this house before the morning even comes. She walks out to the road and says, "When I got there, I was forced to sit to rest me under the hedge. And while I sat, I heard wheels and saw a coach come on." She takes the coach and says, "Just take me as far as you can for as much money as I have," and ends the chapter saying, "May you never appeal to heaven in prayers so hopeless and so agonized as in that hour left my lips. For never may you," she's talking to the reader, "like me, dread to be the instrument of evil to what you wholly love."